We'll look at some of the cluster editing now. I have a grid here with a number of clusters. In wireframe mode, I'm not seeing a whole load here. If I were to go to hidden line, only some of the clusters are turning up. And that's because I've actually applied materials to the clusters, which you can see here. Things like wiggle and block have no material assigned to them. What they do have, if I were just to hit enter, is a display color. So as I were to change this, I can actually change the display color. Turning on unselected clusters actually gives me a bit more control. So now here I can see the purple cluster and its material. If I were to select, say, the wiggle here, I can change the color for unselected objects, so now it's now green. So there's a little tip there in order to work better with clusters. Selecting and editing is slightly different. With the Explorer open, it's very simple for me to select individual clusters just from a list. With the object selected, I can hit cluster over here and again get my list. If I don't have this open, it becomes a little more tricky. Or does it? If I were to go inside polygon mode, each of these is in fact a polygon cluster. In order for me to select that cluster, all I have to do is hit in the selection tools, cluster like so. And now when I select a part of that cluster, you can see, there we go, it's getting selected. So part of that cluster, and it's selected. Each of these is becoming additive. So for instance, if I were to select this cluster here and deselect this one, I can start to edit it. If I were to select polygon mode again, it's automatically still in cluster mode. So once I've selected the cluster I wish, deselected the ones I don't wish, I can simply take cluster off like so. And now I'm back in standard polygon mode. With these ones here, I can now say, right, I want to remove this selection from this cluster. So edit, remove from cluster. In fact, it does nothing, because if we were to look inside here, I haven't defined which cluster to remove from. Now, with the Explorer open again, I can hold down Control now and select green. You noticed up here it now says multi-2. That means I have two things selected. One was the components, and now I've added to that selection is the cluster. With this I can now say remove from cluster, and there we go, it's gone. I don't need this open, I can still use the cluster property up here to work in the same way. If I were to say add some of this, I can select cluster, hold down Control, select the other cluster there, and then add to cluster. Select cluster, hold down Control, remove from cluster. So using the cluster property when you're in a component mode is a very handy way to add and remove components from that cluster, as well as just select. Working with these clusters is not only useful for identifying selection sets, applying deformers or materials to it, but also for texturing, being able to isolate individual areas which will be defined in the texture editor for UV editing. When working with clusters, the selection, the addition and the removing, it has a bearing in the selection mode that you're in. So in extended or SI3D mode, I've been working with edges, polygons, and in this case the cluster selection filter up here. So now when I rectangular select, I will select that cluster. Middle clicking will deselect. If I'm in the standard XSI, which doesn't have any of these on, and I'm in polygon mode, when I middle click, I automatically select the cluster. This is very useful because I don't have to keep going to the cluster selection filter up here. But this is for rectangular selection. If I were in, say, polygon raycast selection, now when I middle click, I select the cluster, but I'm also selecting an individual point here, which means I have a double selection. To remove a single part of the polygon from the cluster, it certainly is convenient to select it this way, because I can always utilize the plus and minus key in the bottom right hand here. So if I remove that from the cluster, there we go. Otherwise, if I were to do things like have my polygon selected here, I will then middle click like so. I still get that additional selection. So after selecting my points here, let's say select these here, I will switch to rectangular select and now select my cluster. That will undo, so I will hold down Control, middle click, select my cluster, and now I can either add to or remove from the cluster. The little plus and minus is to the add or remove from cluster. It is the same when we're in object mode for adding and removing from groups.